Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started again. I really have the pleasure of introducing Beth Bauer to you. And now everybody in this class, in all locations, has heard about you, Beth. So, because I came to class a few weeks ago raving because two of the mentors, Jessica and Dia, who you will see on the chat, had emailed me late one evening and asked me if I knew where they could find a database on a particular issue. And I think it was something to do with cosmetics, but I'm vaguely...
Safety of the ingredients.
The safety of the ingredients. And I thought, well, I have no idea whatsoever. But I know somebody who works in the pharmaceutical industry, and this is vaguely related to that. Maybe she knows. So I quickly sent a message to Beth, and shockingly enough, within 5 or 6 minutes, a list of databases came back. It wasn't just, can you explain a little bit more, Judy, which was what I'd expected, or that's a bit out of my field. It was actually results, which I immediately passed on to the mentors who will be here tonight, and they were able to utilize them in their projects. So I asked how you'd done that. You said, well, of course I used ChatGPT. Why wouldn't you? And I thought, why wouldn't you? Why didn't I do that? Anyway, all of them heard what a very good idea that was. And because it is the #1 problem for data jam teams, their most difficult part of their project at any time during the year is finding data that they can analyze to answer their research question. They're pretty good at coming up with questions. Sometimes the questions are too vague and they're not answerable, and so having a hypothesis is difficult. But once they work with mentors, and these mentors are becoming very good at getting the teams to hone in on an answerable question, they're all nodding because they've spent the last couple of weeks working with the community college teams participating in Data Jam this year in doing exactly that. They need to find a data set, and that was just such a really good idea. We had been talking in this class about using AI or teaching strategies for getting AI to be able to teach you how to do different analytical skills. And why it hadn't occurred to me to ask about databases, I don't know, but we thought that was wonderful. So who is Beth? Beth is a data analyst. She trained at Carnegie Mellon University. She has a master's degree. And we were introduced to her through Brian, who you just met, because they went to school together. But she went on, she lives in New Jersey. We're very lucky that she's come here tonight. In part, I'm sure that's because we have a board meeting this weekend for Data Jam. And she's the vice president of the board. She now owns her own data analysis company. She'll tell you some about that tonight. She has been really, really energetic in the Data Jam and driven us in new directions. So from reading the newsletters and me talking to you a little bit that we are really getting a huge increase in visibility of the Data Jam website through social media. Who's the person that was constantly putting pressure to increase the social media campaign? That would be Beth. And the first few social media posts that I wrote, she read and said, oh no, this isn't going to work. These are way too boring. They need a complete and total overhaul. And so she overhauled them. And then she looks at posts that I write, and if I can pass her muster, they are interesting. She has also been trying to get us to interact more with businesses, particularly businesses in local hubs. and was responsible. If you read the November newsletter that just came out a few days ago, she was responsible for setting up a field trip in Boston for the Boston Data Jam teams with the Gates Institute, and that was remarkably successful. So we are grateful to you, Beth, for all the pushing you do on us, and we would miss you if you weren't here. I think you guys will really enjoy her talk, and keep an eye on the chat.
Will do. And I have till about 8, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. I don't know if I can live up to all that. The very first thing that I'm going to say to all of you is the most important thing in your careers is the relationships that you have with all the people you know. You just heard that I got involved with the Data Jam through Brian. We went to see, and Yvette, his wife, we all went to CMU together 1,000,000 years ago, and maybe 20 years passed and we ran into each other at a reunion, and Brian was like, I want a new job. I'm like, I have a job. And we ended up connecting, which then got us connected to the Data Jam, and it's data and we're connecting all these different points, and that's what brings me to you today. So I'm super excited to be here. Let me share with you a little bit of my background. So I'm currently founder and CEO of Posiroy, which stands for Positive Return on Investment. I got really frustrated probably about 25 years ago that as companies were moving forward and taking different actions, they were not intentionally thinking about what they could be doing. And so the whole concept there is to add a guarantee or a close to guarantee of positive returns by actually thinking through what you're doing so that you could actually build actions that will lead to those positive returns. And data is a great way, the way. Data is knowledge, data is feedback, data is everything that we communicate, amongst each other. We then construct data based off of what we prioritize to digitize. Right? That's really the ultimate piece there. But data is all of that. So I've spent 35 years in the world of big data, 30 of it doing the data science end that Brian described, really helping largely big pharma and big pharmacy retailers to be able to figure out how to use data to decide what medicines should they actually create. How could they begin to actually get a brand new disease constructed and then accepted by the medical community that this actually is a disease that they should treat and they should use their medicines. And then how do they find the customers who actually would use those medicines and ensure that they can provide them to them in a timely, accessible manner, working with a variety of stakeholders across the entirety of the healthcare system. In order to do that, I had to learn about the healthcare system, about medicines, about marketing, about all of these things. And you'll find that if you really want to dive into working with data and have an exciting life, like how Brian described it, because as you can tell, I love data. I love data so much because you can find out anything with data. And if you stay on the path of innovation, you can actually continually do the same type of work and never do the same thing twice, which is amazing. So much fun. I will add that one additional piece that everyone needs to know is if you spend your life like that, you're going to be terrified all the time. I mean, it's just a fact. And the reason you're going to be terrified all the time is because if you're working in innovation, there's no book to read, right? You're going to be doing something new constantly, and you're never going to know what you're doing because you're doing it in a new way. You may take old information, that's what innovation is, take something that you've learned and put things together, and now you're going to apply that in a new way. And it's frightening. And a lot of the people who work in that area are very scared. And if you get used to become comfortable with being uncomfortable like that, you're going to have a lot of fun, a little nerve-wracking, but once you get over that piece, it certainly makes a very exciting career. So I spent my time at a combination of IQVIA, which used to be a company called IMS, which was owned by Dun & Bradstreet, and Dun & Bradstreet owned a conglomerate of data companies, including the competitor to IRI, who Brian worked for, a company called Nielsen. Have any of you ever heard of Nielsen? It was, so back when people watched television, that was a really big component, that it tracked what people watched on television. So Dun & Bradstreet had put all of these companies together. What was then IMS was a company who, they started with surveys, believe it or not. Data in this area, bringing together data, started in the 1950s. And so they were able to actually bring together a conglomerate of information about the drug industry and how drugs are distributed in medicines throughout the country. This then grew. They realized the economy of data and began to actually track everything about healthcare. So at this point in time, in a HIPAA-compliant, encrypted manner, pretty much every pharmaceutical transaction that occurs in the United States is tracked and goes through that company. That's a combination of the pharmaceutical transactions, some hospital transactions, some insurance transactions, pretty much all of this, so that we can actually begin to understand how disease and patient journeys occur. I had the beautiful experience to have spent 10 years building the innovations in that data space, and then another 5 to 10 years being my customer. It was terrible for the salespeople, right? They're trying to sell me, and I knew the product better than they did. But it's a very unique lens, because now you get to build these big data systems, really data beyond. So we've only been saying data science and big data for, I don't know what, less than 10 years, maybe around 10 years. And I've been doing it for 35. So 35 years ago, as Brian described it, we had dummy terminals. It was literally a keyboard with a green screen, like you see in the Matrix. And we talked to mainframe computers. And so if you describe to someone, I'm working, well, I didn't have the term big data. I didn't know how to tell people what I did, right? So the best way that I could describe it was I was a data detective, because I could use data to figure things out. Now we have words like data science, and that makes much more sense, but I think the data detective is still a little bit cooler. So an important thing to understand is that all of that data that Brian described actually gets brought together. A company like IQVIA, for example, is a pure data company. The amount of information that is brought in, so you use data sets, right? And in the data sets that you use, have you ever tried to merge two data sets together, like maybe county, right? Now imagine 1,500 data sets that are tracking patients all have to be brought together into one harmonized way so that we can understand how people go through the healthcare system. It's a little bit hard, right? And there's a lot of algorithms that go into that, and there's a lot of systems that go into it. This is thinking about data in ways that most companies would like to be using data today and into tomorrow, but struggle because it's hard. So I'm going to walk through just some basics. This is a long list, but we're going to do it in an interactive way. I have included some slides. I was hoping that we would be able to look at some of them ahead so that you could actually shout out some things to me, but I don't think that happened, because before you said you didn't read Brian, so you probably didn't read mine either. So I have slides that will show some of those things, but I'm not going to talk to them. So the important part of this is that at the beginning, and Brian alluded to this, everything that we do in capitalist societies is related to making money. And so we have to think, and even patient care in healthcare, there's a business of healthcare, right? Which means that, yes, we want to optimize also to patient care, but we also have to be thinking about, well, how can we do that in an efficient, effective manner? And how do we get the right patients depending on what we're doing? So how do we begin to think about the fact that we want to prioritize what intentional actions that lead us to positive outcomes on whatever those outcomes are, whether it is money or patient care, for example. We're going to talk about insights as a factory. What does that mean? That is, there's this holistic system of data that in any large company, certainly any health system, and because of the cloud, now smaller companies are beginning to take in data as well. And how do you begin to think about the totality of taking in data as a system and treating it like it's a factory? Because at the end of the day, that's what it is. You're ending up creating a product. People talk about data products today. To create a data product, you create a little bit of a factory to do that. GSD. Do you guys ever hear the term GSD? No? Oh. GSD can mean a lot of things. We're going to talk about it as goals, strategies, and decisions, but that's also for getting stuff, I'll say stuff, done, right? And so how do you get stuff done? You need to set up some goals, strategies, and decisions. We'll talk about adaptive innovations, knowledge systems. Has anybody even heard that term? All right, you're not. You have?
It, like, for behavioral economics a little bit, or maybe loosely related.
That's I'm sure that it's a concept at the moment, because we're just beginning to get the large language models combined with small language models combined with RAGs and knowledge graphs are allowing us to begin to think about how we can create knowledge systems. So that's awesome. I'm going to expect you to be talking a little bit later. And then show me the money. What does that mean? It's not necessarily the money, it's the impact, right? The whole reason we're doing any of this is to be able to actually do something. And if you're going to do something, you should be able to measure that something. And I swear everything's measurable. So there are a variety of ways that we want to be able to take a look at that, and we'll have a brief start. And then start where you are. So prioritizing the business. I'm just going to put this list up here so that you can actually talk to me, not so that I can read that to you. The main part here in prioritizing the business is, again, thinking about why is it that we want to look at something. So if I go back to pick any client that I've ever worked with, they're like, give me this data. Give me this data. Well, what are you going to do with it? What? What do you mean, what am I going to do with it? Well, when you get it, what kind of actions do you want to take? Never thought about that. Well, why do you think you needed the data? So does any of this sound like what you go through with the teams? Does anybody have that kind of experience? Like they'd say, oh, we want to study something, and then, oh, we need this kind of data. Well, what actually are you going to measure with that? Is that something that you guys experience?
Yeah. Like, for example, my mom, she has to go on Microsoft Teams, and she has to like discuss with the team about the data and who does what, or it's like programming.
And do you find that you but I'm not Microsoft Teams, but the teams that you're working with Data Jam, do you also find that like you have to help them to be able to formulate what is it that you're actually trying to do?
They have to like interact together to manage the data. Yeah. But yeah, I guess in Data Jam, I could say the same thing too.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's all the same. Did you want
I
to
was going
comment
to say,
as well?
my team wanted to look at seeing if COVID-19 like negatively impacted like how often people were going to national parks. And I was like, it's a great, like the question was already framed really well, but when I started bringing up like, how do you want to measure, like which COVID metrics are we going to look at? Or like, how do we want to try and figure out like what's actually changing, like the rates of people going to parks? Then they were like, oh, and it like made the discussion a lot broader, and we were able to get a little more nitpicky about it.
And then you actually
And
get
then
to
we-
something that you
yeah.
can actually measure. Did you want to add something to that too?
Yeah, with my team, they're doing an analysis on soccer players entering NCAA, and
Soccer players entering the NCAA?
yeah, so Division I, like college soccer from high school.
Oh.
High school soccer.
Sorry, I was like, what?
And they want to say what percentage of high school soccer players go on
Oh,
be in
mm-hmm.
NCAA.
So I thought it was a very interesting question, and I know there's so many statistics and data behind sports, but I had to get really nitpicky with them because I was like, well, how do you want to measure the success of a player? Do you want to take their stats when they're in high school, or do you want to take their stats when they're in college? Do we want to factor in their SAT scores or their grades? Because that also factors into the college you just generally go to. So there was a lot of discussion, and I don't think were completely aware of all the sort of like micromanaging you have to do with the data you're using. And then, like you said, using the data you collect together to answer your question.
That's awesome. I just want to share, I'm so thrilled that you're all in the Data Jam, because at the end of the day, the kind of work that Brian and I have historically done, it's also called principal consulting. And at the end of the day, every business that you'd work with is going to be just like your Data Jam teams. And you're going to have to go through the same process, because they're like, "Wah, I got this problem. I don't know what to do. Come help me." And then you have to help them to guide through, like, what are you actually trying to solve? How are you going to get there? And what information do you need? And most importantly, how are you going to get to those decisions, and why is this important, right? Is there anybody online who wants to add their experiences with that? I'm going to share a simple example. One of the key things of why I bring up, there's a long list on here. Some of them you may understand, some of them you may not. Ask ChatGPT. And by the way, then validate and read the articles that ask it for the articles, and then go read the articles too. Because by the way, I didn't just send the list, I then checked every single database to make sure it met the criteria that they were interested in, because you should never take what you get out of ChatGPT.
She still did it in like 5 minutes.
Thank God for the internet. But a simple example would be, I worked with a pharmacy retailer who was interested, well, actually every pharmacy retailer, they were all interested when the Affordable Care Act included medication adherence as a component of making sure that for Medicare Advantage plans, the old people in health insurance, that people actually could get the medicines that they needed. And if they had chronic diseases, that they would have access to those diseases, or to the medicines in there. And it turns out that, in big companies, they move people, like one team does something very specific. So one team's goal was to get new patients to come to the pharmacy. Another team's goal was to improve medication adherence. But it turns out that when you actually dive into this question of medication adherence, and you twist it and turn it, and you have access to a huge database that allows you to look at this patient journey, that you can actually see that when a patient is new to a chronic condition, there's a huge acceptance issue. I don't want to take this medication. And so anyone who was within the first 6 months of their medication journey had terrible medication adherence. So now you see there's a conflicting goal. If I take in a lot of new patients, I'm going to have worse adherence, right? Because the new patients have bad adherence. But if I take patients who actually have been on medicine and get them transitioned, or look at it from a different angle, now I could have good patient adherence. So one of the things that actually being able to look at all of this data did for them is to be able to say, we actually have two goals, don't we? And so maybe we could actually segment and set different goal criteria for the new patients versus the existing patients. The data scientists had to guide them through that. So there's a lot of recommendations when you can dig into data that you can provide. Data storytelling. Has anybody heard about data storytelling? Ever? Yeah? What do you think that means?
I think it means talking about like the variables in like a personal way that makes sense to the audience. So you kind of make a report that's engaging.
I love that. Anybody else? Yeah?
I was thinking that like a lot of times when you're like in like physics classes, you work with a lot of equations, but I remember like this was back in high school for me, I'm not a physics student, that a lot of my teachers would say, each equation that you work with, like whatever field you're in, economics or math or physics, is that it's a relationship between things, and that there's a way to take this very like quantitative phrase and be able to actually, understand it in terms of what are the components of it, what is it relating to. That's what I think of when I think of data storytelling is like, yes, I could take this and then say like, oh, I'm going to use this model. But it's a lot more valuable to understand the process. Like, why are you doing this with the data, and really what's it telling you at the end of the day?
I love that. So you both, it's all of that, right? Because it's basically, particularly for us data scientists, we sit there with all this data and we crunch through a ton of numbers, and then we look at things, and then we look at something else, and then we look at something. We probably look at like, I don't know, 100 things before we actually say something. And then we come to somebody like, hey, I found this insight. And we walk them through the journey of how did we get there? Why did this matter? And how does that get placed into the context of whatever it is that you're looking at? We have to walk the people through the journey. Actually, I'm going to come back to the Insight Factory because getting at this next piece probably ties in with the data storytelling. We'll come back, remind me to come back to the Insight Factory, because that's how we put all this big data together. At the end of the day, a lot of people, most people, don't necessarily understand their decision-making process. There's a whole line of science called decision science. And one of the goals of using data is to make better decisions. But if the people who are looking to use the data haven't been through decision science, well, they don't know how to use data to be able to make better decisions. So some of the work that we as data scientists end up having to do, and it depends on what line you're in and what you're actually working on, but is helping to guide what those goals and strategies and decisions would be. And so the easiest way to think about that is to ask in context when you're in the working environment, what is it that you really want to accomplish with this data? And why this matters so much, particularly as we get into that big data that Brian was talking about, right? There's data all over the place. Depending on where data comes from, it can potentially have biases in it. It can have holes. So for example, if I get data from an insurance company, let's say, and then I want to say I'm going to track the journey, and maybe I have 2 insurance companies, and I can, in a HIPAA compliant way, put this information together and track patient journeys. But maybe for a little while you were uninsured, or it wasn't those insurance companies, and now I can end up that there are holes in your journey, right? And I need to understand how big those holes are, and whether those holes end up saying, did I miss something completely, right? And how would I be able to handle that? Where your data comes from absolutely matters to the question that you're asking for and what you are capable of answering with it. And I actually just a week ago got into a whole thing with a bunch of computer science people on LinkedIn because they're saying, the business just tells us what to do. I'm like, what? Yes and no, because there's a responsibility to think through as the data person, what does this mean, that where this information came from, and does this cause implications to what we're looking to do with this? Because at the end of the day, you hear this whole data world saying, oh, well, we don't trust the data, and the data's bad, and we have bad data, and I never get the right answer. Usually it's when you don't have the goals and the decisions aligned to what the data actually is. Because if you haven't married that all up, you can't build a correct data story because you haven't been able to build in all of the caveats for where you can use it and where you can't. So you always want to try and make sure that you bring those goals, strategies, and decisions to be able to actually get this stuff done. So adept at innovation, which is the main point of this overall talk, is an acronym that I ended up creating, which really talks about the entirety of the process of how do we innovate with data. So it's an interesting thing that we find that as we say, ooh, I have this data, we can now do something new in an area. the first human reaction to any innovation is, I don't need that. I don't know where that came from. I don't want to use it. It really doesn't matter if you come with the answer of, we've cured cancer. Do you want to take the, here's this new mechanism. People's reaction, human reaction to innovation, the first time they hear it, is a barrier. So how can you begin to actually break down those barriers? Because every time we find new insights with data, basically we're creating new types of innovations. And sometimes if we can bring a lot of insights together, that innovation can be very large. And so Brian walked through some individual examples, but in some cases, those are literally game-changing to a business or to a health system, right? But in order to get there, you need to be able to get your customers, the people who've requested this data information, to be able to trust you, and you have to be able to convince them that this is something that actually is important to them. So ADEPT is an acronym we're going to walk through. The first component, as we start to think about any data, is what are we going to do with the data? Why do we collect the data? To put it into the cloud and forget about it? No. What is it that you're all doing in Data Jam with the data? Hint, the word is on the page. Yeah?
Yeah, we're using analytics, making models, or applying the data.
Exactly. You're going to do a lot of analytics. Are the analytics any good if they just sit there? No. So the next piece is those analytics, the little nuggets. I call them nuggets. The little nuggets get accumulated and get turned into insights. Well, I don't have an I in ADEPT, so it became acuity. Acuity is another word for insights, which basically means we're going to take this data and contextualize it, right? The analytics then get given to humans or ChatGPT and large language models in general, or just in as many ways as that you can, so that you can begin to actually see now that I know this nugget, what does that tell me new about my world? And it's the accumulation of those insights, or acuity, which actually allows us to think about how we can apply this in ways that will matter. We talked already about the data and decisions, but at the end of the day, if you don't understand the decisions that people are interested in, you can't bring the right data. And sometimes, I would imagine in your data teams, I'm 100% certain that you've run into this. You start with a question, you want to make a certain decision, but then the right data just isn't available. Right?
Yes, I'm going to nod my head for every single one of their teams.
Right, it's just not available. So how can you now change and evolve your decision? And I like to add to this, if only people could add the scientific method to this, so that you can say, I want to understand this question, and then this question, and then this question, so that you can look at these things in some form of sequencing, so that you can begin to more fully understand your world. That almost never happens. But it would be ideal if people could apply those scientific methods to the thinking of their decision process, right? Have you guys found that you have had to, you said yes, that they had to change it. What are some examples of how you had to change your data questions based off of like the decisions that you were looking at and then the data?
I'm going to jump in to kind of echo what Ayush said, because I think this is a really, really common problem. The teams come up with questions. They find a data set that has some data relevant to the question. But once they start actually thinking about it, they realize there's a whole lot more complexity. So he was talking about the team that's looking at soccer players
Right.
in high school, and do they go on to play soccer on an NCAA team? in college. And what do you look at? So they got their soccer data from high school, but now what do you look at? Do you look at how many goals somebody made? Do you look at other rankings of them? Does it matter where they go to college? And they just become awash with, oh my gosh, what data do I actually?
And now it's overwhelming.
Well, it is overwhelming, and for the teams, and these are community college teams, these are not high school teams. So they realize it's hard to make a decision of what data you need and what data are you going to analyze, which I think we try to reinforce when we're teaching this class, and they all try to reinforce it with their teams, but it's a hard concept. It gets exactly to what you're talking about here, which is you really have to think very hard about the question, because the data doesn't tell you what data to use. You, the person trying to answer the question, have to decide what data is meaningful. And that is a hard concept to get across at every level. And I think they need to really be able to do it to guide their teams, that you have to think about yourself. What exactly is your question, and be very careful about what data you decide to look at to answer that question.
So this issue is probably the number one issue in the real life application of data everywhere. Everywhere. I mean, that's what keeps us employed.
Well, then you guys are doing a good job training your teams.
Well,
because they
100%.
have had trouble with this across the board.
I mean, those skills are just, you can apply them to literally everything that you will do in the future. Because that's ultimately the main issue. How can you leverage that skill and talk about it and use it in the real world? A huge part of this is the ability to actually share with whoever your customer is, your team is, what potential implications there would be of looking at it in a different way. Like, what does that mean? And walking them through that process. And it's amazing how, because we don't teach in general decision making at all, except if you're in decision sciences, but to everyday people, of why would this question be more important than that question? Or do we have the ability to answer all of those different questions, to begin to prioritize why it would be important to use one data set and have one particular set of questions versus another? And that is the ultimate goal of everything that we're doing. I mean, think about the examples that Brian went through. There were all these different things that could be done with it. Well, how do you prioritize what you want to do and begin to walk through that in a methodical way? I mean, that's essentially a big part of working with data. Does anybody want to add anything to that?
People online, you can add in chat.
Sometimes that means pivoting.
Exactly. Oftentimes. Most oftentimes that means pivoting. There's a lot of pivoting. And an important part of pivoting in the business application is you can then decide, if you had to pivot, okay, for today, because in the world of business, like, decisions have to be made right away. So do I wait for this bigger data set? Do I create this bigger data asset? Do I get somebody else to create this bigger data asset for me? Because my original question is absolutely the most critical question. And in some cases, the answer is yes. But more often, the answer is, well, what could you tell me today? Which allows me to make one step forward. And then maybe let's take this step today, and we'll think about how do we tackle the bigger problem for tomorrow, right? And so keeping track of that is, again, critically important. All right. This ties into what we just had happen here. Because at the end of the day, what that really means is, if you want people to utilize your what you found, the nuggets to be applied to their data and decisions, they have to care, right? That means that, just like Judy was talking about the talks that they give, like if you can't engage your audience in what nuggets and insights that you found, they're just gonna sit there and nobody's gonna do anything with them. So you have to be able to get good at the data storytelling. You have to be able to get good at being able to identify, relative to their decisions, what impact does this have for our world? Why do I care? And then the reality is you're going to have to find different stakeholders. So Judy said she gives all these talks, and it's great when 1,000 people hear it, but it's even better when they go talk about it. Well, that's basically people who are beginning to become supporters of you and your ideas. And the more that you can bring passion and insights and story to what you're saying, the more people will go, just like she talked about, an engaging talk is going to get people to talk about it. This is true in everything, even if it's just a one-on-one conversation. And the most important part of that is how can you get them to pay attention based on impact? So since we're in the whole space of technology as well, and this is just a giant mess for data scientists today, because we create a lot of dashboards. Do you guys ever hear about dashboards? Do you ever use any dashboards to look at, manipulate interactive things in data? Have you ever seen anything like you go into, I don't know, a newspaper article and it allows you to click on a state and then you can look at more information for a certain state? Like, that's an interactive dashboard. So in companies, this is rampant and they build dashboards all over the place. What I have found, dashboards to me are like the encyclopedia. We were talking about this the other day. Do you even know what an encyclopedia is? Right? So when I grew up in my house, Judy had one too. I don't know about Brian and Yvette, but we had an Encyclopedia Britannica in our house. And it was literally, you know, a set of books that sat on a shelf, a lot of dust, and every now and then you bring it out. You know, now you have Wikipedia, which is fantastic. But the point of dashboards is, how can I bring information that gives you an idea of what the status quo is? And so people go into dashboards and they're able to track trends on their products or whatever it is that they're interested in, and they can see, you know, the lines are going, maybe they can interact and look at, you know, differences by state, they can look at differences by time, you know, whatever it is that you want to be able to do with it. But big dashboards tend to be so big, like the Encyclopedia Britannica, that you can't get through it all. Right? Nobody reads the whole Wikipedia. Right? You go there for the little nugget. So what's beautiful about what's happening about Gen AI today is that it can sift through all of this data, right? And begin to push the little nuggets to people to say, huh, go look at this. And then the humans end up going and looking at where the AI sent you, and now you begin to actually put that together to be able to create the nuggets that go back to the acuity, right? Being able to put it all into context. But what that means is that we have to be able to create the technology that actually will enable people to find insights. We have all this data, all these insights are hidden in that, but it takes somebody asking a question to be able to get that out. So we have to create technology that actually enables people to ask more relevant questions that impact what we want to do. And if we haven't thought about how we can enable people as we're going through our data science, it's almost no point. If you create all this work and all these insights, and then it just sits on somebody's desk collecting dust, like my old Encyclopedia Britannica, right? It's a waste of energy, right? Because we just had to put all this energy into creating it, both human and electricity and storage, etc. But worse, there's so much to be known, right? That we could be pulling out. Do you guys ever use technology where, you know, you're like, ooh, this is so cool, and then you go into, yeah,
I
tell
was
me.
thinking about this this whole slide. I really like use Spotify as like my music player, like instead of Apple Music. And Spotify has been they've been doing a lot of stuff where they're trying to integrate like AI to make like you can now prompt a playlist that it will make based off your, like if you have music saved in your library
Right.
already. This feature came out like a month ago maybe. That like you can say, oh, like I want a nice picnic playlist or something similar to that. But I think there's all the time that I'm thinking about like, oh, I wish I could find like, to get specific, my big problem with it right now is that whenever you make something that's generated, it's generated specifically catered to your music library already. And I wish it had a feature where it was like, oh,
Show me something new.
show me, right. No, because I keep using it and it keeps showing me the same, and it's new when I
Yeah,
get in there.
yeah.
They're gonna fine tune it over time, but it was like it got to a point where I kept running into the same wall that I thought, oh, and I haven't played with this yet, but I thought, oh, maybe Chat GPT would be a good resource and say, oh, here, like these are things I like. Recommend me things that are similar to this, maybe regardless of whether or not you think it, might be something that I'm really going to love.
That is an awesome example. There were some social media, I think it was LinkedIn, that for a little while was like, oh, I'm interested in this. And then it would say, now give me the alternate perspective. Like that I wouldn't normally, which, oh my gosh, I wish we had that on everything, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all getting taken down silos, right? We're getting taken down our little rabbit holes, and we're just getting lost in those rabbit holes. I, for a little while, had Google News on my phone, and then I found myself clicking into like, I don't know, the same articles over and over. It's like, how many versions of this article can you send me and I'm going to read it? And finally I was just like, I'm turning this off because I'm wasting my time. I definitely clicked the bait, right? I clicked the bait every single time. They know how to hit my buttons, but it's not doing me any good because I'm just hearing the same things over and over again.
Still in the encyclopedia era is scientific journals. They're a collection of all of the things you would want to see in a dashboard in paper format in ways that you can't really understand until you've either read the whole thing or had someone give you a digest, which AI has, at least for me, rapidly increased the pace at which I can read, digest, and utilize scientific information.
That is a beautiful example. Did I discuss any of those things with you previously? Because on my to-do list is exactly that. Like, why can't we just be applying large language models to every scientific journal out there so that we would have the ability to pull insights out immediately to be able to use with patients? I mean, why isn't that in every doctor's office? Right?
A digest on the diagnosis you just received in whatever your usual language speak is.
Well, here's a simple example of exactly that happened in my real life with, sorry, Alex is my son, little side note, with his grandfather. When you get old, if you get to get old, like really old, like 90, you begin to have difficulties in handling your heart versus your kidneys. And it becomes a really careful balance. And you usually have to take blood thinners. And if you have to take blood thinners, you have to take have regular blood tests that test your INR, which I have no idea. Maybe you know what that stands for. I don't know.
I think it's your clotting.
Your clotting,
ability to
right.
clot.
I don't know what
Yeah,
INR
because
stands for, but
neither do I. But I think if you can't clot, you're
right, you're going to
risk
bleed out,
bleeding.
bleeding through every pore in your body, which is a terrible thing. And it turned out that for my father, he was having a situation. My father is now passed, not because of this, thank God. He had a situation where the doctor's office was supposed to have him schedule a blood test every, I think it was every 3 weeks, something like that. And they changed staff and forgot. So for months, he didn't have the blood test. And it turned out his numbers were getting bad and he began to bleed out. I get a call from my brother. Dad's going to the hospital. It's the middle of the night. He called an ambulance. He lived alone. Normally your INR should be somewhere around 2, and they tell me, oh, his INR is 13, and I'm like, clearly they made a mistake. It was 3, right? No, it was 13. And you die from this, like immediately. So I found out, and I have no medical training whatsoever. I'm only a data scientist who's worked in health data like forever. I'm a statistician, so I can read statistics and medical articles and understand it's all math. So you just read the math, and now you can understand what the medicine was, right? So I come to find out that they're going to give him, I think the standard treatment was potassium, and that is the standard treatment, okay. But then I, pre-ChatGPT, read as many Medline articles as I can about what the current treatments are in that space. And I come to find out that in the current articles, plasma is a better outcome than potassium. So I call my brother and say, tell them, why are they not using plasma? And they're like, oh, right. Why aren't we? They give him plasma, and he got out the next day. Many other people die. And it wasn't that they weren't smart. It's just that it was the latest research. And their training has them, like, in this situation, you do this. But when the latest research, there's just too much new knowledge coming at us all the time, which, I mean, I said too much. It's great because we can save more lives, we can do more things, but you need to have an awareness to it. And we humans just can't possibly have all of that new knowledge immediately in our brains. But why can't we leverage all this big data to be able to help us to do that, right? It's not the decision making, it's the, did you have a question? It's not the decision, it's not that the AI would make the decisions. I think that's a bad idea. We definitely need humans in the loop of everything. By the way, we need multiple humans in the loop because we need to cross-check the humans too. Humans need to, AI needs to be checked, humans need to be checked, all of it needs to be checked multiple times because things change, treatment patterns change, what you're going to do in a particular process hopefully evolves, then the checking processes for that need to evolve too. All right. Oh, well, right, processes. So there's people and process involved in everything that we do with innovation. And we just talked about some of the enabling technologies, et cetera. If we don't have the people and the process available who want to engage and be enabled with the new decisions and analytics and acuity that we brought, nothing's gonna happen. In order for execution of any ideas to happen, that means that you need to have the people and process that are aligned, right? And those people had to have been engaged. And then they need to be thinking through, what are the implications to my life? So if we just go back to that simple example with my dad, in that situation, should they maybe be thinking about adding additional processes or checks when patients have that kind of condition? Like, should that come up on a screen when you're in the ER and for the doctor, like, hey, think about this? Like, are some of those things part of how we would want to change processes and how people think about solving different problems? I'm going to give you a simple example that's a little bit different than what we just looked at. A million years ago, have you heard of pharmaceutical reps going to doctors' offices? You ever heard of that? Okay, well, in the 1990s, I created at IQVIA with a team the data that would be accessible to pharmaceutical sales reps to be able to understand the prescribing behaviors of physicians. This leads them to, if I have product A, which is good in disease B, I know who to go to because they're writing a lot of disease B. They're going to be interested in my product, right? I mean, it just makes sense. In some cases, this got abused and then regulation came after, which is really good. But in most cases, actually, a lot of physicians get their new information from pharmaceutical sales reps. So over time, that has evolved, that humans no longer do as much connecting with physicians, and that information comes through a variety of channels. And when we started to describe, like, hey, you know, doctors want to get information from one other human, but they also get information from the web, or they get information from email, they get information from a variety of different ways. And how about we use all this data to begin to evolve how we do that communication? Well, what's the first thing humans do? No, that'll never work. That's not going to work. So they said no, because that would change how sales reps interact with the medical system. This is a million years ago. Eventually they got there, but it's fascinating because you could show, well, you could save, you know, literally millions of dollars in human labor on this particular problem if you evolve your process to actually have people do something different. And again, if you don't get them to engage and enable that and get their buy-in, it doesn't happen. In this case, it took probably 15 years before that actually evolved to the point where they were accepting it. That's a long time. It's still like that, and we're going to find more and more and more change like that because we have so many more, we have so much change happening now, right? That's the one part for you guys. Does that feel overwhelming to you? Like old people, yeah, it feels overwhelming to you too? Yeah? Would you prefer that the world didn't change so fast? Yeah? Interesting.
I was going to say, I think it's almost in a way a little easier being kind of part of a generation where like you had a lot of changing technologies growing up. Like it wasn't like I didn't see too many like groundbreaking shifts, but that like really made me like, what's the phrase, like teaching an old dog new tricks.
Yeah.
Like I think you have a generation that's like, we're used to learning tricks a lot in a way, in like a silly way.
They're never gonna become an old dog.
I
huh?
know. It's like you have all these people. I think it's a little different where nowadays it's like I feel a lot more flexible with technology than I would say compared to either my parents, and then especially compared to my grandparents who would like still have problems sometimes operating like a flip phone. But in a lot of ways, like that's helpful. It makes like I'm more adaptive to trying new things, but I'm also, I think a big thing is that on like the decision side of things is that I have a higher propensity to be willing to like abandon those like past behaviors because there's always like a new thing rolling in. And I think, and for this case, for like new processes and like speeding up the time it would take a lot of people to adapt like a new process, I think that's a helpful thing. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff, and it's definitely overwhelming
There is,
sometimes.
and it's back to that uncomfortable feeling, right? And sometimes we find that actually that our ability to want to adapt has to do with, well, is it going to do me any good, right? And that's actually a really important thing to ask ourselves, because if we constantly only take every adaptation, like we may never be able to like have some sort of stable state, but we don't necessarily have to take every single step of that adaptation, right? It can be that we leapfrog, right? So we want to think about change, and change that we want to move toward in a way that gets prioritized to what we want to accomplish, right? And be able to guide people to do that too, because, well, again, another simple example actually relates to my husband, who's not here. So don't tell Dad. He had wanted to buy a new camera, right? And he was like, oh, digital camera. Oh, the next iteration is going to have this. The next iteration is going to have that. The next iteration. And I'm like, dude, you don't buy the camera, you're never going to have a camera, because there's always going to be something better, right? So you want to, as you're thinking through, even in the big data spaces, because this actually comes true in the big data spaces too, do I want this vendor or that vendor? what are the implications of me buying this one versus that one? What are the capabilities that I'll be able to have? If I begin to just start to evaluate this, I could be evaluating forever. You need to be able to identify what's going to be important to you so that you can actually pick the changes, make some decisions so you can act today, and then think about, okay, if I take my next step, what's going to be important to me from that? What are you going to say?
I'll just say change is exhaustive in both tangible aspects and mental aspects.
Wow.
So we see a new iPhone every year, guaranteed. The amount of change from iPhone to iPhone individually, minuscule. Going from the iPhone 6 to the iPhone 16, huge, absolute big jump. So I think part of that calculation is also not only will it do me any good, but is it worth the cost
Yeah.
to move there now? Or should I wait until it is such a large difference in gain that I have no reason to stay where I am?
And now let's take that one step further into the world of big data, because as they think through that exact same problem, you have to think, if I wait too far, I may be so far behind that I can't catch up, right? So all of these things need to be balanced in those decisions. So the last piece in this is the technology and the trust. So that discussion we just had of like, well, do I want that new technology? Like, this is a big part of it. And at the end of the day, it's always anchored in the trust. So if we go all the way back to the A on the analytics and acuity and the E on the engagement, like all these components along this adept continuum, really what they do is allow your customer, your team, whoever you wanted to be thinking about, to trust that you've thought it all through. You've thought about the implications, you've thought about the data, you've thought about their decisions, you've thought about how they're going to use it, and they begin to trust you more, which means they're more likely to take your next innovation. Because now they've created a relationship with you that hopefully will last 35, 40 years, that actually allows you to then them to think about having you be brought into that even earlier. And the earlier that data scientists and people thinking about data come into that decision-making process, the better it is for everyone. Because if they don't include the data at the beginning and begin to do that iteration back and forth between the decision and the data itself, you can end up with a bunch of monkey muck. And at the end, they're all going to say, oh, those data scientists don't know what they're doing. And in the end, it wasn't about the data scientists. It was about this understanding between the data and the decisions and their ability to actually use it with the technologies that they have. Right? I mean, the Spotify is another example right there. Did they ask you before they came out with that? Or did they do customer surveys on some of that, right? The question is, how much product testing did they do, from what groups, et cetera, so that they could actually understand why they would want to change their technology for what purposes. And there may be that there are, like, could there be an option? There are people who want to hear the same song over and over and over again. And then there are other people like, ooh, I want new music brought to me. And maybe even the same person wants to be able to change between that. So wouldn't it be great if you had options? You have to ask people and you have to have those conversations in order to have those options. I'm probably going to not get into the knowledge systems right now, other than a big part of this whole concept of the knowledge systems is, as we discussed, there are all these different aspects to what we are trying to understand in our world. Some of that means that we're actually trying to understand how the world itself is changing. We need to bring that in as we think about how we want our business to be run. There's also how your business itself is changing, like what capabilities are, what technologies that you have available, what human people and processes you have to be able to do that. A simple example, I heard Beth was here last week, yes? Talking about legal. Like,
Right.
I haven't.
Talking about public algorithms and how governments are using data, basically.
I didn't hear her talk, so I don't know what her talk was about. But the what I had found in the business at Merck is that one of the simplest places where we could begin to actually apply Gen AI was in our legal contracts, because a lot of legal information is a lot like code, like it's built on precedents and there's rules, and it turns out that actually, because individuals were creating all these individual documents, depending on who the individual was, what team they had, what experiences they had, you'd end up potentially with different contracts for the same kind of thing. So by using AI, we can actually begin to ensure that the language of those contracts remains similar for similar purposes. A human in the loop, right? Because we need to make sure that we're being accurate about that. But that is one of the key things, which is just an example of how capability within a business could shift based on the use of data and AI. Another organization who I'm familiar with in a factory situation, they took the entire history of every incident that had happened in a factory and began to put that into a combination of a RAG model and a small language model to begin to actually understand what kinds of issues do they have in the factory. Because now they could create their own little internal ChatGPT, right, based on their information, which says, oh, we have this problem today. And you tell it the problem, and it tells you it's most likely this, based off of your factory situation. Well, isn't that magic? I mean, that's magic. That you can actually tell, here's this little situation that I had. Here is the most likely example of what it is and what you should do. This is extremely useful, and our ability to take in the processes that we have in companies, in systems, et cetera, and to begin to guide us on doing better the next time on our own information is going to be key, and knowledge systems will help us to get there. And at the end of the day, the last piece on this is the relentlessly prioritize. In every situation, because of the amount of change that we have going on in the world, we are going to need the capability to set a North Star of what it is that we're looking to do, right? But the world is changing constantly, so we make a plan, but then we have to recognize that maybe tomorrow something big changes, so I need to shift a little. And that ability to continuously rethink how we get to our North Star based off of that world changing is going to be key. And you need to think about that in how you do your analysis on different things, right? The tools and mechanisms that we have available to us are changing constantly. And how does that change what we want to do? A simple example in chemistry. So as you're thinking about creating medicines, you have tools in a laboratory, right? Physical tools. And you do measurement of different things based off of the tools that you have in that laboratory. Because of data and digital twins and a variety of synthetic data that we can create, can simulate different situations and let you know whether outcomes that you're looking at are actually real outcomes or based off of your ability to measure it. And being able to digitize that actually allows us to begin to see, it's like putting another filter on looking at the galaxy. Have you ever seen that with the Hubble Space Telescope? Depending on the filter that's placed on it, you see a completely different thing. This is the same thing that's true in data. What filter, what context you put on it changes what you see. So being able to think about the variety of ways that we want to twist and turn that is really helpful.
We should leave enough time for them to ask you questions about what you've talked about, but also where you've gone career-wise.
Yes, I can't even get to the next slide, so that's okay. The last two parts on that were just a combination of show me the money, which is, we talked about that already, the variety of ways that you can think about impact. Value is not just about money, it's even about health outcomes and getting people to engage with music and being able to hear new music. Like all these are different value metrics. And then the last piece is just start where you are. Wherever you land in your work, how do you begin to invoke change on innovation is just pick a topic and start, and you go from there. All right. What questions?
And questions from online, you are welcome to put them in the chat.
Oh,
Yeah.
so like for Merck, for like medicine wise, do you use any knowledge systems, any AI models to help with approving medicine with your team, for example?
So I worked on the commercial side, but I can tell you that actually the largest use of data and AI is on the R&D side today. It is incredibly powerful to begin to put together combinations of chemistry, genetics, and technology to begin to actually identify what will work in what scenarios. And super cool on that, not just on the drug discovery, is the ability to actually tie together now how people will react to certain drugs. So there are genetic tests that actually tell you if medicine A or medicine B will be more effective to treat a particular condition based off of your genetic profile, which is just unbelievable.
Does that like constantly change? Was that something that you found before, or is it just better, more accurate?
Well, so as with everything in data, there's little leaps that happen that unlock a huge amount of, so discovering the human genome and being able to break that apart, which just, I mean, that had to happen first, right? So that began to happen, and now we're just on the precipice of the types of things that they'll be able to, like certain cancers only occur with certain genes and things like that.
I think you might have a question online.
So for someone looking to be a data analyst or data scientist, are there particular certifications or tools we ought to be proficient in? What tools do you use most often in your line of work? So I stopped being a data scientist probably about 6 years ago, which is just about when Python and R went crazy. So I did most of my work in SAS. Are you guys familiar with SAS? Okay, so I was an expert coder in SAS. It still is hugely out there in the healthcare space, particularly the FDA actually requires certain code to be utilized in SAS. A big part of that, going back to that chemistry example, at least the last time I looked at this, which is a very long time ago, probably about 20 some years ago, SAS had the most decimal points available, 16 decimal points in the calculations. And it turns out that that really matters in medicine, that when you're doing really complex, deep calculations, you can end up with very different results if you don't have enough decimal points. And SAS was the only one at the time that actually had enough precision to be able to discern life or death situations. I have no idea if they're, I don't know, Brian, if you have any idea if Python or R have any of the similar precision or issues?
Python does, yes.
Has the similar precision?
Yes.
Okay, so there you have it. So it depends on what you're going to be working in as to which tool you would want to use. One thing that I have noticed that seems to be skipped over in a lot of statisticians training, I don't know what your backgrounds are, is SQL. So simple query language to be able to use, to be able to access some basics in databases is something you really want to make sure you add if that's not something that you've already had. And if you're really thinking about the knowledge systems of the future, knowledge graph is just about the coolest thing out there. And there's a variety. Oh, Brian's smiling. What do you want to add? For the knowledge graph ability allows us to begin to think about how a particular element of information can be looked at in context. And so you can store the information in a way that allows us to do that twisting on a variety of topics simultaneously. That said, there's a variety of ways that we want to be able to put that together, so that I would never say that you want to learn that exclusively, because at the end of the day, you need multiple tools to be able to do the analysis and really begin to look at it on a variety of platforms.
This says the meeting is scheduled to end in 10 minutes.
It is.
Okay, do
Yes, and
I
the
have to hit a button? Extend 10 minutes or dismiss?
You can extend, but
Okay.
people will need to leave.
Okay,
so.
yep. So somebody asked Power BI and Tableau.
So this is a fascinating question. So, Brian's got other things to say. So Tableau I have found to be very useful for making beautiful graphics.
Tableau Public is free, and Data Jam suggests freely available programs. So we have a lot of information on the website about it.
And I will add that Tableau is really going to be useful anywhere you go. A lot of organizations are looking for Tableau. I'm laughing because Power BI has not been my favorite. I don't know. My favorite, most people haven't even heard of, and I got excited because Gates MRI was using it. And my favorite from a visualization is a tool called Spotfire, which it functions a little bit similarly to Tableau. The reason why I liked it, and I asked Gates MRI why they liked it too, is because it's
MRI was Medical Research Institute.
Yes, medical research. Sorry, yeah, medical research institute. Is that I have found that to do that digging in the data visually, it was easier for me in Spotfire than in a Tableau. Tableau blew everybody away in terms of the visualizations that you can create for reporting on, but I like to be able to dig in and find the insights. Maybe you need both. Brian, did you want to add something to that? A little Oracle pitch?
No, I'm just saying they all do 80% of the same thing.
Yeah,
So it's important to learn how to use a tool and do it well.
yeah.
And those skills will translate easily.
That's true. That's true. Data visualization in general is something you really do want to be able to use because it's great for data storytelling. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Whenever it comes to making connections like you have with Brian, and sort of building that community within the statistics world, like, is there a way that you would go about doing it differently than like just going on LinkedIn and like following people and shooting them messages?
Well, you already took the first step because you
Right.
joined the Data
Yeah.
Jam. Which honestly, and Judy knows, I would love to see that we can actually turn this really into a full-blown community, because there are so many people who are really interested in furthering the conversation on data and having more people utilizing data in an ethical and useful way. That is just so important to our future, because we can really end up in a bad place if we start doing a lot of things on bad data. So I would say anything where you can join people where you can actually meet them. So there, if you're a statistician, there's also the American Statistical Association. There's a variety of different organizations that are popping up all over the place. They have meetups sometimes with different people. You should connect on LinkedIn with us, because we know a lot of people and we're happy to introduce you. I myself
That's
would.
the Data Jam.
Yeah, well,
On
us.
LinkedIn.
Right. Well, it is, but it's not randomly connecting with people on LinkedIn. And I would say that actually even utilizing LinkedIn to be able to really begin to create connections with people, strangers, if you have something intelligent to say or even comment on people's posts, do it. Right? It's so terrifying because they're smart people with all these great things. Just like, wow, that was really insightful. Could you tell me more about that? Maybe they won't respond, but maybe they will.
I
And
think you have a couple other questions, and I'm going to use the last 2 minutes to make a couple announcements.
Following up on the previous question, what's the best way to network? I think we covered that. And how often is no SQL database used for data analysis? Is SQL mostly preferred then?
I can't answer that question. Do you
Is
know?
that how often is no SQL?
No SQL versus SQL.
No SQL is not used often for analysis. It's usually a data storage that, if they do have a SQL interface, can do some stuff. But I see more often it's transformed and moved into a relational database or Python data frames, R data frames, etc.
I think that covers it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Very